Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the VOX-Pol report, AI Extremism, Technologies, Tactics, Actors. It's my pleasure to host this event and discussion today. I'd like to thank our discussants, the authors of the report, my colleagues who helped plan the event, and the audience members joining us for today's event. We're using a webinar format, so please use the Q&A function to post any questions you might have, and feel free to have a conversation in the chat as well. I hope that's lively based on the topic. To introduce our discussants today, Stephane Baele is Professor of International Relations at UCLouvain in Belgium, and Honorary Associate Professor of Security and Political Violence at the University of Exeter in the UK. His research, which appears in Terrorism and Political Violence, in the Journal of Language and Social Psychology, among others, focuses on the role of communication in extremism, political violence, and insecurity. Lewys Brace is Senior Lecturer in Computational Social Science at the University of Exeter in the UK, where he is the co-director of the Center for Computational Social Science, C2S2. His research, which appears in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and Crime and Delinquency, among others, harnesses data science, open source intelligence, and artificial intelligence methods to study extremism, terrorism, and cybercrime. So we're looking forward to your discussion of the report today. And just to outline the program for the audience, after you speak about the report, I have a brief response, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Audience members should feel free to post your questions throughout the program to the Q&A function, and I'll make sure to capture those. So Stephane and Lewys, please take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay, so, well, first of all, thank you for organizing all this. This is how we're going to proceed. So I'm here with Lewys, as you just said, and the way we thought we would do it would be for me to perhaps summarize the main lines and structure of the report in a kind of matter-of-fact way, looking at the different sections that we have in the report and some of the main themes that are going through the pages. So I will just go through the report briefly to kind of summarize what's in there, and then Lewys will try to extract some more transversal themes and issues that we thought we would particularly like to highlight, not just specific points in the reports, but broader questions that came to our minds while we finished writing the report. So I'm going to speak first, introducing the report, and then Lewys will go second, trying to extract some main themes, some particularly salient points of discussion. So the report really is called AI Extremism. So really what we wanted to do was to try and see what are already the various ways through which AI is used, can be used potentially by extremist political actors to promote their goals and their strategies and their actions. So we're not really interested in something that has received a lot of attention, which is the use of AI to counter extremism. Of course, as we'll see, and perhaps what Lewys is more going to discuss is, of course, these 2 points are articulated or connected. But we're not talking in the report about how to leverage several AI models, for example, to detect or to monitor extremist content online or to disrupt extremism online. What we really wanted to do is to take an extremist actor's shoes and try to see what could we gain by leveraging various types of AI models and technologies. So we try to try to see what can an extremist actor gain in using these technologies. What are the various models that they could potentially use, for what purposes, for what objectives, and as we discuss, in fact, we noticed that quite a few of these uses are already being, being implemented by a series of extremist actors. So what we're witnessing is the beginning of the use of AI by extremist political actors. It's of course not yet, a systematic use. It's not yet really a strategic use, a large-scale use, but we see here and there examples of extremists using AI, to do something or to do another thing, but not yet in a very coordinated manner. Now, of course, there is an emerging kind of literature that looks at these specific examples and these early, if you want, early tremors, as we put it in the report, of AI extremism. So typically, so we don't have many academic articles looking at this. Actually, there are maybe 1, 2, 3 off the top of my head, but there are quite now many shorter pieces of long journalism, or pieces such as JNet Insights or blog posts for VOX-Pol, compact pieces that focus on one specific use. Let's say the use of generative image generation models by Al-Qaeda supporters, to take just one example. What we wanted to do here in the report was to go beyond these, if you want, case studies or these specific examples, these papers that focus on specific examples, and to try and zoom out and really think, what are all the uses that could potentially be out there? And of course, in the report, we build on this pre-existing knowledge that colleagues have done to give some examples of things that are already taking place. We also use our own research and observations of what's out there. So we try to map the different uses of AI by extremists, and to do so, we differentiate in the report between basically 3 types of AI models, right? First, we look at content generation models. So typically, this is what we call generative AI, right? So the models that are primarily designed to generate text content or image content, video content. We look at these models. This is for perhaps scholars working in extremist communications. This is the most, if you want, intuitive use of, the intuitive AI extremism. But actually, we also look at 2 other types of models: strategic decision-making models. So the models that you find, for example, if you play chess against a computer, well, that computer nowadays has an AI strategic decision-making model behind, But also the third type of model will be the pattern-seeking model. So AI models that are trained to detect some patterns in a very large data set based on the training that they have received on another data set. So for each of these types of models, content generation, strategic decision-making, and pattern seeking models, for each, we really try to look at what we can call, of course, the dual use of these models by extremists. So how can extremists use each of these models, or all the models that belong to each of these categories, to promote their interests? So as such, the report is taking part in, of course, a much bigger reflection, scholarship on what we can call the dual uses, or the nefarious, the malicious uses, the dark side, if you want, of AI, right? And we have so many now papers and books about these dual uses and the problems in nefarious, malevolent uses of AI. And extremist use of AI is one of these, multiple different dual uses, bad uses of AI. So how do we do this in the report? Well, In the report, we have this map, which is in a way an affordance map of AI extremism on page 24, in which for each type of model, we try to identify all the affordances that these models have and what they enable extremists to do. And so for the next 10 minutes perhaps, what I will do is to go through these affordances, going type of model after type of model, but I'll try to be brief, just to give pointers to the report and to give an idea of what's in there. So in the report, we first look at the most intuitive, as I said, type of model when we think about AI extremists, and of course, this is generative AI. It's all these models that automatically churn out texts, images, videos, generating voice, that kind of stuff. And here we see a lot of different possibilities. The first one, of course, is to just produce extremist propaganda, to train models so that it generates ISIS magazines or incel forum posts or neo-Nazi, or white supremacist forum posts and stuff like that. So that's the most, of course, intuitive, right? You use these generative models to do what they're supposed to do, which is to generate text or images or videos, and you train them to be proficient in your own brand of extremist language, So you train it to become a white supremacist, text generator, for example. So we discussed that. This is the most obvious. Other people, and we build here mostly on what other colleagues and scholars and journalists have identified, but also on our own work, which tried to test whether or not this is actually really possible, really plausible, really credible. And we identify in this part of the report also the balance between risks and benefits that, as an extremist, you face that balance when you use AI to generate your extremist content. It comes with a range of benefits, for example, increased quantity, but it also comes with a series of risks. Yeah, for example, if you can have if you pretend that you're producing original work and then people notice it's not authentic, it's been used, it's been produced by an AI model. Well, you have a series of legitimacy hazards and authenticity depletion effects that we discussed in the report. So it's not all benefits. It has a lot of benefits because it's very easy to mass produce high quality extremist content, but it also comes with a series of risks. And what we discuss in the report is that these risks are not equally, not all extremist actors face these risks. So we differentiate between various types of extremist actors, and therefore for some there is absolutely no or very little risk in using this, whereas for some others they really should not use that because, for example, they place a lot of importance into gaining intellectual legitimacy in their, for example, in their own ecological niche. So that's the obvious one, but actually there are also a lot of other possibilities that generative AI offers to extremists. And I'm just going to cite what we discuss here. It offers a range of possibilities for blackmail campaigns, blackmail strategies to extract money, to extract information. It can really help extremist actors to impersonate other people and therefore to gain again access to information, influence. It's also a very powerful tool if you want to conduct harassment campaigns. It can really boost the amplitude and the intensity of your harassment campaign. So that's another use. Another use besides, propaganda generation or blackmail, harassment, and impersonation is you can use that to artificially boost or flood a platform. So if you're building, let's say, if you have a Telegram channel and you want that Telegram channel to look like it has a bigger audience or a forum, and you want to make it appear that you have a very large audience, which can have then a real cumulative effect because people go where the audience seems to be. Well, you can artificially boost your forum, your Telegram channel, whatever, by generating fake engagement in your platform. But it can also be used, and as we know in extremist online ecosystems, you have a lot of competition between groups. AI, generative models can also be used to flood in an adversarial way, in an aggressive way, one of your rivals' platforms, right? You flood it with junk content or with aggressive content, or you can try to reorient the discussion towards themes and issues and ideologies that are more in line with yours. So we call that adversarial flooding, but you can also have, as I said, artificial platform boosting in a more positive, for self gains. The problem with all this, right, with the propaganda generation at scale, with the impersonation, blackmail, and harassment campaigns, with the platform boosting, the adversarial flooding, the problem with that is that it has it has some kind of cumulative effect, which is discussed in the report, which is that, of course, of a pollution of the information environment. And we're going to start, to see an information environment which is already being polluted by extremists' communications, but this pollution is likely to grow with the help of automated generation. So, of course, generative models, right, as we gave here some of the main uses that we discussed in the report, and that's, tautology, generative AI generates content, but generative AI also helps you to gain information, right? And this is something that has been already highlighted a few months ago in a paper by Myron Laconi, in which he says, well, generative AI is not just to churn out extremist content in this sense. It's also potentially to access information, just as people ask ChatGPT, can you help me write a letter to my boss, or to do this or to do that? Well, they get some information. If you ask, for factual information, sometimes it's made up, but sometimes you can have you can gain information. Now, in Laconi's paper, we tried to gain some information about several things, and we wanted to go further into testing whether we can gain information from generative AI models, both these that are openly available, like ChatGPT, but also some that are also openly available, but which are open source. And this is something that Lewys is going to talk about afterwards. Models that don't have like a platform like this on the ChatGPT, where anyone and everyone can easily interact with it, but models that are open, open source, open science, and if you know where to find them, you can work with them. And these models, why we tested them, because they tend to be less constrained than less constrained than the big ones like ChatGPT or Bing. There's less attention being paid to what the model is going to refuse to say, or to not going to engage with your prompt. But also these models can be as well fine-tuned. You can fine-tune them, and potentially you can train these models to become a tool for know-how and information access for extremists. So we tried to see if we can get instructions, for example, on how to build an improvised explosive device, how to build and how to make Molotov cocktails and how to kill people. And so what we found is that it's never going to be as good as the kind of detailed resources that people can access in terrorist magazines, for example, the notorious, how to make a bomb in in your basement, in your kitchen, that Al-Qaeda's magazines or rubric in Rumia magazines, ISIS magazines that kept on instructing how to kill people, how to build weapons. It's never going to be as good as that. Nonetheless, some of the models were quite keen, especially the open source one, were quite keen to help, especially if you put them in a situation where very easily you pretend, for example, to be afraid of explosive devices. So you say, well, when do they explode? How do they explode? Or if you pretend to be to create a scenario for a movie, and then it's going to detail a scene, and these were quite accurate in fact in helping you to do that in terms of violence advice. How to build weapons, and so on and so forth. But also in the report, we discuss other kind of know-how. So, for example, how these models can assist you in carrying out and designing offensive cyber operations, or how these models can also help you to translate stuff, sometimes immediately, to enhance your online privacy, and that kind of stuff. So this is for the generative AI models. You can see that it goes much further than just churning out neo-Nazi forum posts. You have a lot more you can do with these tools. I'm going to go more briefly on two other types of models. Why? Because here we're not in the immediate term, like for literally all these types of affordances for the generative AI models. We can already see examples, real-life examples of extremist use. For the pattern recognition models and decision-making models, we don't see yet, but there's a real possibility that these uses are going to be seen in a near future. But these are more difficult uses. So, for example, pattern recognition models, the main dual use that we see in terms of extremism is that of using these models to help advanced and more organized or state-backed terrorist groups to build chemical and biological weapons. And we couple that with the recent advances in synthetic biology, in which we show that when we have synthetic biology already indicated as a big threat for well-organized, well-funded terrorist organizations to acquire and to deploy and to develop chemical and bacteriological weapons, pattern recognition AI models, they can actually speed up some of the processes opened and lower the barriers that are still very high when it comes to synthetic biology, but it can really act as a tool that lowers the thresholds that you have to move past to exploit this possibility. So we discussed the likelihood or not of acquiring and developing chemical and bacteriological weapons, mostly. Now, in terms of decision-making models, we think immediately about the kind of, we discussed everything that's in games, and this kind of model is probably the most discussed in international relations and in military studies, because these are the models that have, for sure, now percolated into strategic command and control, but also in lethal autonomous weapons. Yeah, and so here we discuss the likelihood of finding lethal autonomous weapons being developed and used by extremist political actors. And again, we fall back on this observation that this will happen inevitably, but it's going to come from more organized typically state-backed terrorist organizations that have the finances, that have the backing of some research capabilities behind. But we're not into the realm of something like in the very distant future. Very clearly, for these groups, to operate autonomous lethal weapons is something that's going to happen. Again, the progress of AI models and their availability and their democratization make them increasingly easier to deal with and to harness for these kinds of uses. So these are the main points that we really discuss in the paper and the report. We give examples and we conclude with some policy recommendations as well as to what to think about that, whether or not it's really going to enhance the threats, or are we more perhaps in a situation where because it enhances the threats to the state is also more likely to harness the tool to fight back and to create some kind of new equilibrium. What we like to stress in the report in the conclusion is that this time, so the next couple of years really are going to be critical, because this is a pivot couple of years in which you have a high vulnerability. People are not very aware of what AI can do. I mean, it's pretty fuzzy. They don't really know how it works. They can't really recognize what's fake from what's not fake. It's becoming increasingly difficult to recognize it. And states and government agencies are not, up to speed to counter it. So we're going to be in this, couple of years, very, very dangerous pivotal moment. And we discussed that in the conclusion. I've spoken too much. I'm going to just hand it over to Lewys for some transversal, as we said, points or things that we want us to stress.
Thanks, Steph. I think that was a very succinct summary of an 80-page report. So yeah, as Stephane said, I'm just going to tease out some bits that we discussed in the report. And everything I want to sort of discuss and tease out can come under a sort of umbrella notion that both terrorism and extremism and technology are not static phenomena. Okay, they're constantly changing. The nature which we're seeing that change over the last few years has increased as technology has increased and got more powerful overall. With this notion, there's two main things we need to think about going forward. Firstly, we need to think better about how we can establish long-term workable cooperative relationships between governments, academia, and big tech companies. And as part of that, the second thing, we need to also have a well-informed, coherent discussion about timescales. So what is an immediate threat, i.e. some of the stuff Stephane was talking about, generative AI, and some of the stuff I'll talk about in a moment. What's a medium-term threat? And what is a long-term threat off into the future? And I'll get into all of those in a moment. Focusing on the more immediate term, things that are actually a threat now concerns the use of generative AI, and Stephane has already spoken about this a little bit. These are models that are designed to generate content, whether that be audio, visual, with visual being either images or video in terms of sort of deep fake type stuff. And here I think we're seeing a major shift. We seem to be seeing more of a blur in between sort of some of the stuff we see that traditionally fits within the traditional ecosystem space, some of the stuff that fits more into this quote-unquote generic disinformation space. We're starting to see those overlap more and more. And I think we're starting to see this in terrorism statistics and so on, with the rise in what the Home Office referred to as new, mixed, unclear, unstable ideologies, which really gets to this idea that the affordances of technology are now allowing people to engage with different bits of ideology and create their own bespoke ideologies that sort of appeal to them and their own personal life experiences. And part of this is being driven by some of the mainstreaming of these ideas, which in turn is being put forward by this sort of boost effect that Stephane was talking about, the way in which this content can be generated much quicker and can be spread out onto mainstream platforms with greater ease. We're seeing larger quantities of this kind of content not just appear on dedicated sites or forums, but in things like comments on YouTube videos, for example, where it's text disinformation that's been developed by some of these large language models, for example. And as we start to see the mainstreaming of these ideas, we have to acknowledge that large amounts of people start to engage with these ideas, and they'll start to act as a sort of gateway. And I think part of that links into, again, the need for this collaboration between government, academia, big tech, and the realization that we need to think about how we're going to deal with this kind of generative content in the long term. In the UK here, we've got the online safety bill working up and running, but that's the sort of macro level approach which tries to remove dangerous content as it appears online, but being realistic, we're never going to remove all of this content. Even back before, these advancements in generative AI, there was too much content to remove. Now that problem is 10, 12, 20-fold. So what we have to do is kind of go, yeah, okay, that's a good first step. Let's try to remove as much of this content as possible. But we also have to think about other approaches, such as sort of essentially inoculating young people in the sense that we sort of teach them to sort of try and spot this sort of fake generated content online, to think critically with some of this information and some of the stuff they see. We know that we'll touch upon this a little bit in the report, that studies have shown that people tend to uncritically engage with information that sort of abides to their own sort of preconceived bias and confirmation. I think one of the other things we've sort of seen about, when not so much in the academic sphere, but perhaps in popular media, popular understanding of generative AI, there's been a lot of focus on videos, so things like deepfakes. More recently, there's been a bit more focus on generated AI images. And I can understand why that's the case, right? These are visually appealing. But I think one of the things that we don't talk about much, sort of outside of academia, is the role of audio deepfakes, which are huge. And it's much easier to generate a convincing audio deepfake than it is a video deepfake. So, for example, one can imagine that following the death of Sahiri a while back, if an audio deepfake had emerged a few weeks later, claiming to be him, talking about recent events that's happened over the last few days, one can imagine how that would very much have a radicalizing effect on people. It could motivate someone who's already sympathetic to that ideology. And this sort of blend of this increasing sort of overlap between some of the extremist stuff and the sort of turbocharged disinformation we're seeing as a result of generative AI links into this notion that Stephane mentioned about the pollution of the information environment. At the risk of sounding a bit hyperbole, as we know that an unstable social political environment is a hotbed for extremism. When things are unstable, people are unsure, people experience a large amount of uncertainty. They are more prone to engage with ideas critically. They are more prone to engage with ideas that might seem simplistic and easier to understand, and many extremist ideologies are designed to be that way. And finally, my final thought in terms of the short, immediate term, focusing on generative AI, again, touching on what Stephane was saying, we talk about in the paper, about how this generative AI goes beyond just extremist radicalization. Okay, when we talk about generative AI and radicalization, we tend to focus on that lot on that quite a bit. Whole notion of how it can be used to generate and share propaganda at scale we haven't seen before. But you could just as easily see it being used by certain state actors for blackmailing in order to secure funds for operations. Perhaps blackmailing someone to act in a certain way that helps them achieve their specific goals, or even just, as Stephane said, straight up harassment of people who are critical of the organisation. Shifting tact a little bit, let's touch a little bit on how it's structured in the report. When we look at the other types of models, so we move away from the generative AI models, we move more towards the sort of strategic decision-making models. We can see, while at the moment, extremist actors might, as Stephane said, might not get too much use out of those, we could see a situation, at least without state backing. Like I said, it's important to note that technology and terrorism is constantly evolving. So there is likely to be a time in the future when extremist actors could make use of this technology. It might not just be AI in terms of strategic decision making, so it might look very different to say how standard militaries use it. When we look at standard military use of AI, yes, it's used in autonomous weapon systems, but it's also used a lot in logistics management and medical evacuations, those kind of applications. It's obviously unlikely that extremist actors are going to use it for those applications. What they might end up doing is combining it with other emerging technologies. So, for example, store-bought drones are getting increasingly cheap. In the UK, a couple of years ago, we saw just the sheer amount of trouble a store-bought drone caused at Heathrow Airport and stopping aircraft from taking off. Combine that with some other examples we've seen in recent years, and I think one we mentioned in the report is some YouTuber who worked out how to attach a handgun to a home-bought drone. One can imagine a situation sort of in the future where extremist use of sort of AI combining these sort of home-built kind of weapons could pose an actual threat. And this is what I sort of meant at the start of my section when I said we need to sort of we need governments, big tech and academia to sort of work together to talk about the actual threats posed in the immediate, medium and long term. Because the threats are going to be very different. And admittedly, sometimes this technology jumps in such a speed, in such a way that stuff that we thought wouldn't be an issue for 10 years suddenly becomes a massive issue. We saw that with the large language models, so ChatGPT and so on. We weren't expecting the kind of jump we saw there to happen right away, and it did pretty much overnight. And it changed the field quite a lot. So yeah, I'm going to end my little talk there, but before I do, there's kind of one major bit I want to sort of focus on, specifically about these models. These models, whether it's generative AI, whether it's strategic decision making, the vast majority of these models now are based on a specific form of machine learning called deep learning. This deep learning tech doesn't just power generative AI and strategic decision making. It powers a whole bunch of things that you might be familiar with in your everyday life, such as your Alexas or your Google Assistants or any of this kind of tech. These are essentially powered by what we call artificial neural networks, and long story short, these are bits of computer code that are kind of supposed to simulate how neurons operate in our heads. And basically, they make a decision about how to do something based upon whether or not a specific combination of these neurons fire at a certain point. Whether or not these neurons fire, and therefore a certain decision is made or not made, depends upon what we call the weights of each of these nodes. Now, many of the advancements we've seen in AI lately have been about increasing data and increasing the algorithms to such a point that we can manipulate these weights to do what we want with greater precision. Certain big tech developers, such as Facebook's Llama and so on, they try to put safeguards in place to stop these systems being used to develop extremist content. So, for example, Facebook's Llama is a large language model, so it's like ChatGPT. They try to put safeguards in place to stop individuals from, say, using it to generate extremist propaganda or the kind of instructions Stephane was talking about. However, not only can you sometimes get around these with careful prompting, like Stephane was saying about, saying how you're scared and you just want information, that kind of thing. The problem we've got is that we have to, with these models, strike a balance between between keeping these models and weights private and keeping them open. So when I say keeping them private, I mean keeping the weights hidden. If we keep the weights hidden, then the only people that can sort of control those weights are the big tech companies. Now, this does prevent non-state and non-big tech individuals from altering the weights. That means like people like you and I, Steph, we couldn't get one of these models, we couldn't tinker the weights to make it do what we want. What this also obviously means that extremist actors, therefore, couldn't tinker the weights to generate extremist content that we don't want them to generate, which is a good thing. But the flip side of that then is that we very much then enter the situation of a black box approach to these models, where we don't know how they exactly work. And that would be very problematic going forward as these systems increasingly form part of our day-to-day life, not just in big decision making, but in literally everyday life. And I think, given the time, I'm going to end my monologue there. And we'll open up for Q&A.
Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you so much for that. Actually, as chair, I'm using my privilege to have a little very short response and start the questions off myself. For people attending the webinar, please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A and we will collect those. So I wanted to really thank you both for the talk and the report. In my reading, I found sort of the depth and nuance in your exploration of potential uses really important, particularly in its broader scope of possible actors and approaches to extremism using AI. In particular, the affordance approach stands out to me as an essential way to sort of think through and map this issue for a variety of actors, including researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And that's because it enables a really concrete discussion of practices and uses in a context that can be often highly abstract. And I think it also offers a playbook, which is particularly important given the wide array of technologies, the ongoing versioning of these technologies, with distinct differences between versions, and sort of the rapid pace of growth and change in the field. So this affordance-based model and the way you've laid this out is really crucial for both understanding specific potential uses and use cases, but also for applying an analysis going forward, right, as that change occurs and the field develops. So from my perspective as a researcher reading the report, it really engaged my thinking about sort of a variety of socio-technical and digital cultural practices through this lens of AI extremism and affordances. And within that context, there were sort of two areas that you touched on briefly in the report, but that stood out to me in terms of my wanting to know more. And admittedly, this is because they're facets of my own research approach. But those two areas were really sort of issues around networked coordination and sort of, as a communication scholar, what I think of as audience enjoyment of hate and conspiracy, rather than sort of being fooled by disinformation. So in sort of thinking through that, you mentioned that there are, broadly speaking, three types of actors: extremists or terrorist groups, malign state actors, and then audiences. But the audiences you sort of positioned as the much broader audience, right? This sort of unsuspecting audience. But this made me think about like sort of coordinated audience manipulation. So we could think about the disinfo dozen, the quote unquote disinfo dozen with COVID, or what Becca Lewis has called the alternative influence network, an arena I work in, or accelerationist networks, collectives like Terragram, who are essentially malign audience actors, I think as an additional group that might make use of this. And in terms of sort of the enjoyment of hate, right, this issue of near perfect capability and democratization of older versioning of software, enabling, right, improved perfection. In a variety of cases, we've already seen that you don't need to produce a perfect output, particularly with the Hamas issue, the Gaza conflict. We're seeing actors that are using AI to flood the system with information that is clearly AI generated, that isn't, they're not trying to fool anyone with that. And here it's just like people just enjoy that kind of content, right? People enjoy it. A sort of really mainstream example would be sort of Kate Middleton conspiracy theories. People enjoyed participating in that. So with these sort of cases, what also is brought up are economies of circulation, right? And use by sort of extreme adjacent actors in these arenas who make money from this kind of content. And that seems like an additional concern, at least for me. So how do you think AI extremism might be impacted by these kind of networked practices and these sort of cultural affinities for disinformation, as well as these sort of financial economies of circulation? What do you think, what sort of impact do you think that might have as well?
Yeah, do you want to go or should I?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I think you're right. This is something we should have probably unpacked or spelled out a bit more in the report, in which it's true that when we discuss the audience, what we wanted to do is to discuss, to point out that the audience is actually also, it's not just at the end of the process, but it's also the audience, forwarding things and, this further disseminating because they don't know or because they've been fooled. But you're right. I think what you're saying is indeed more concerning. There's an audience that actually participates in the co-creation or in the further creation of other types of tropes, or amplifying by adding new things. The Gaza war, I think, is a very good example of that. I think here in the report we would understand these actors as we would group these in the category of extremist individuals and groups. This is, I think, but we should have to be more careful to not distinguish sharply the divide between the audience and the extremist groups and individuals. Another instance that we discuss in the report that's kind of a bit where you point to is all these discussions on 4chan, Pol, or 8kun, where they have a go at some of the generative AI models, the text creation, the image creations, and then they encourage each other and they take pleasure in creating new content that's, super anti-Semitic, or creating new memes or photos or pictures, and then to disseminate them to different websites or to the forum itself. But I think you're right. There's also a kind of the process of creation of new content and dissemination of edgy or content that could even be as extreme as possible. Look what I found, look what I did with it, right? I created this dialogue or this picture. I pushed the model to create this picture of a concentration camp with, whatever, with Pepe the Frog beating a Jewish inmate or something like that. So you're right, there's that kind of blurred line between the audience and the extremist groups and the people who lead this. And in extremist ecosystems, of course, you always have, when you take an online space, you always have leading individuals, and then you have, as you move towards the audience, it's a continuum of people who engage a bit less, and produce a bit less. And I think we need to account for that. That's right.
Yeah, I think, just two things to add, if I may. I think, firstly, I think there's parts of the literature which are sometimes guilty of perhaps inadvertently portraying audience, so not people who are sympathetic to extremist content, but sort of like quote-unquote the generic audience as passive actors, when they're not, they're engaged with this content, at least for a few more years. Most people kind of tell an AI image, not AI image. The second thing to note about Stephane's point about in these communities, individuals drive one another to try and push these systems to their limit. It's important to note that's not new behavior, right? That's been typical of a hacker community right back to homebrew computing kits before we had home built computers, right? That sort of idea of trying to push systems to their limit is not new. The way in which it's manifesting itself now is, but that sort of innate tendency to do it, it's kind of been there for a while.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that oh, go ahead.
No, if I come back to what you said, also the point that you noticed that in many cases, what these creations actually don't care about is the quality, right? So, in the report, we try to always show that even for a single type of model or one model, you have two kinds of uses. You can either go for the quality or you can go for the quantity. Yeah. But as we move, this distinction is actually less and less important as the models improve. If you would do image generation a year ago, you would have a clear trade-off between quality and quantity. Yeah, and you cannot churn out large amounts, large quantities if you care about quality. But as time goes on, you can actually have models nowadays that allow you to churn out quantity while producing quality. And I think it's this over the next months/years, we'll have this quantity versus quality trade-off that's going to gradually disappear. But it's true that in some actors, they don't care about the quality. They just want the quantity, and that's it. So we discussed the example of the Dublin riots in Ireland, a few months back, in which there were many images, synthetic, fake images of rioters or Conor McGregor leading, alpha males, Irish, these were very obviously fake. But it doesn't matter, right? It's not the purpose is not to fool. The purpose is is different. It's to inflame. It's to pump up the community. Is to portray an ideal world. Is to share emotions. Is to create viral sort of memes. It's not to fool, but yet it doesn't mean that you can't do that. There are other types of uses simply in which you are going to look for quality, going to craft something of a higher quality because you want to fool someone. So if we take some of the examples that we go through in the paper and that Lewys rightly stressed, the problem with voice deepfakes. Here, typically, if you use the voice deepfake, I think you would probably more likely go for the quality because the quality is much more easy to attain, and therefore it leads you more naturally to strategies in which you want to fool and deceive people by making them believe that the person speaking is actually, Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, or whoever, right? And so here, it's a bit the state of the technology that leads people towards a particular type of use, be it quality or being quantity. I would say, going back to this.
Thank you. Yeah, it was in no way a critique of the report. I think the report does touch on it. It's just my interest is in the sort of cultural as well as the technological, right? The socio-technical practice there, which I think is also super interesting. But we have several questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to read them in the order they came in. We'll start with the first one. It says, super interesting. What do you think the most novel stroke differential functionality offered by generative AI, in particular multimodal models, is compared traditional methods used by malign actors? What do you think people should be most worried about?
I think first and foremost, I'd say, again, the scale of this stuff. Like Stephane said, like this stuff, it's getting easier and easier to create fake content that does look real and does look genuine and does have a high level of quality to it. So, for example, I'd like to draw an example that's completely separate from, well, mostly completely separate from extremism. So if we take a look at the deepfake porn industry, going back a couple of years ago, there were companies making large amounts of money off of this. They're not anymore because the technology's hit a point where they can start to generate realistic enough stuff home, so people are no longer paying for it because the quality's got better and better and better. Stephane touched upon this extremist content, right? Like, yes, sometimes it's not designed to fuel, sometimes there's two different things going on, right? If you want to fool someone or perhaps convince someone of something, then this technology is getting better and better, and the barrier to entry is increasingly getting lower and lower. Okay, you're at the point with some of this stuff now where you don't need technical skills. You don't need to spend years of your life learning how to code to do some very convincing images. The flip side to that, as Stephane said, is that you might not even be trying to fool or badify someone. You might just be trying to like stoke a sense of, you know, in-group pride with whatever your in-group happens to be, to try and motivate other like-minded individuals. And I think that's, in a nutshell, that would be my concern, is the sheer scale of it. The sheer scale and the constant engagement. Because, you know, again, we're no longer at the point where someone has to sit down at their computer and wait 20 minutes for you dial up to the internet, right? People are constantly engaged online, they're constantly consuming this content, and oftentimes without even looking at it, like I said earlier, we see some of this deep, some of this generative text stuff appearing in comments, you know, YouTube videos, all this kind of stuff. So it's the scale and the ease of access, which to me is the two things I worry most about.
Yeah, I would agree that like the most immediate problem, the most worrying short-term, you know, problem that we face is the economies of scale that these tools allow extremist actors to conduct. So, you know, you can do much more with much less, yeah. And so you can imagine. So, and this can have an impact. So when you remember, you know, in 2014-15, the Islamic State, you know, producing all these magazines and these photo reports and stuff like that, right? Well, they were dedicating significant resources to do that, yeah. And once they lost, you know, they started to lose these resources in 2015. You could see that they struggled to, you know, to put forward the same kind of propaganda outputs that they used to. Now, they could be more resilient, you know, they would have been more resilient had they had the technology at that point, because to produce a magazine like that, like, you know, Dabik, you could have 10 times less people to work on the magazine, and they would produce the magazine faster, much faster than, you know, than they did. And so it's not just about thinking about how you can just, you know, in what we call the one-click extremism, you can sort of generate stuff and click and click and click and generate. It's also about thinking about the human-machine teams and how you can create a team that works within one or several AI models to produce much more with much less effort, time, and manpower. And I think that's the big, more immediate problem that we face. There are other problems, but we can worry about them, I think, a little bit less right now than, you know, in the future.
Okay, just to cap that off and to give the audience a sense of sort of like how this stuff's likely to progress in terms of timelines going forward. In computer science, we talk about this notion of Moore's law, put forward by a guy called Gordon Moore, basically said, you know, computational power will sort of double every couple of years. We are not only on track for that right now, but actually seem to be exceeding it if we look at some of the stuff that's come out over the last 6-7 months. So yeah, just to cap that off, this speed at which people will be able to generate this content on technology will also continue to increase.
Yeah, and another thing, and very briefly to get to the other questions, but another thing that really worries me, bouncing back on what Lewys said initially, is the voice deepfakes. I really see an extremely high potential for disruption of real-world communities by using voice deepfake to really polarize communities, inflame the situation, especially in times of pre-elections or in places that have already a high level of unrest. I can really see that this can do a lot of harm. One or a couple of voice deepfakes, well crafted, very quickly, in which you have, for example, someone who's heard of the record saying something, awful about another community, for example, right? Or clearly, and I think, with the US elections approaching, I think we will see that, and it's going to be a major problem.
Yeah.
So the next question is, so in terms of extremist use of AI, have there been any groups that you've seen that have best utilized the AI tool?
I think what we don't see yet is a group that really harnesses AI in a coherent and really successful way. I think what we see today are a kind of sporadic uses, intuitive uses that, as you say, people who say, well, I should use that, let's just do it, right? And so we see examples and cases here and there. Some of them manage to get, very large kind of volumes out, but it's not very convincing. It's unclear what it does. So to answer the question, I don't think we have seen yet a very convincing, systematic, well thought of strategic use of AI as for now. That would be my opinion. I'm not particularly convinced yet, but clearly we are kind of heading that way, because you see bits of here, bits of that, and actually we're waiting for the group that would take all these bits and bobs and do something like, okay, we can do something much better than we used to. Let's learn and let's do it. It has always been like that, and in extremist communities, it's going to happen for sure.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Right now, it's sort of very much sort of diffuse, sort of self-organized type stuff. But yeah, like Stephane said, like, just like what ISIS did, right? When they decided they had a HQ, they're going to bring together little bits about mixing pop culture into their radicalization materials and so on. Yeah, you could have a centralized communication structure based off of it in the future.
So the next question is, have there been any indications that extremist groups have utilized this type of report/webinar to gain a greater understanding of AI and generate better ideas of how to utilize AI in the day-to-day?
Yeah.
Well, I hope not.
Yeah, it's always, to be honest, so this is an important question, because it's the question that you ask yourself when you do this, and you say, well, how should we really circulate? Should we really advertise it? Should it be available? Even academic articles, should they be openly available, or that kind of stuff. Now, I think in some cases it has proven to be problematic. So for me, there are cases in which it has produced harm. But I'm not thinking that in terms of AI, but in terms of research on extremism. I can think of a couple of cases where I think it has caused harm, and meaning we should really think about that all the time. Now, when we thought about this here, I think what we say is not something that is groundbreaking to those who want to use AI. I think this stuff is already known, if you want. We're kind of taking stock of what's out there. We're not, people are really interested to push the boundaries of this. They know what's in the report without reading it. So they're not going to learn, I don't think they're going to learn substantially from it. It's different to, for example, reveal in a paper how you fine-tuned a model so that it becomes extremist, right? So if you share the techniques, the technicalities, then you empower perhaps someone who didn't we wasn't able to do it. The report is more interested in sort of explaining what's out there, what are the risks, what are the problems, and for me, it's pretty clear that there's nothing to learn if you're one of the people, one of the extremist actors who really wants to use that. I wouldn't think, or the gain is marginal, really. I mean, that's what I think.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And even like on the papers you were talking about, where you talk about how you can fine tune these models, I think there's a way to talk about kind of what you did, how you did it, and the results of it without actually giving the technical details necessary. So, like for starters, you wouldn't release the data file that contains these model weights I spoke about. You should never sort of release that. Yeah, that's all I've really got to add to that.
I mean, I think if I can also sort of weigh in slightly, I think we're seeing all the uses in the report. I've seen quite a number of them, especially the generative AI ones already, people discussing that, like actors discussing it. But what this gives us is, for policy practitioners and academics, a primer, right? That playbook on being able to respond and think through things, because we're not in those chat rooms trying to figure out how to break the models, right? So necessarily. So I think it is on balance a thing to always think about, but I think there's a variety of stakeholders and actors that also need to understand this, that don't have the time to go out and do that. And that's what this report thoughtfully produced offers.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, that was really kind of one of the key aims, right? To you witness all this, and then you witness a lack of reaction, you witness slow reactions, or very, very broad policy instruments, or initiatives that are too broad to be really effective. And what we wanted to do was to expose all the specific ways through which this technology is being already used, or is going inevitably to be used in nefarious ways, so that perhaps we can guide, provide ideas on where to hit, how to respond exactly to this or that use. And in fact, we've seen the UK criminalize the creation of porn deepfakes 2 weeks ago, I think, or last week here in the UK. So making it a criminal offense to create a porn deepfake. I think this is a very good way forward. I think in extremism, we should broaden these kind of very specific pieces of legislation. You have these very big initiatives like the EU AI Act, or the Hiroshima process, or the Bletchley Declaration. This is way too broad. We need some very specific instruments, like the criminalization of creating a porn deepfake. We should have something like a criminalization of creating a voice deepfake of a public figure, of a politician. It's simply, we need these kind of very specific things, and hopefully the report kind of channels the thoughts of some people, so that we can lead to this kind of fine-grained instruments.
Okay, and this is the last question in the hopper. Please feel free to add more as we go. Since you mentioned these AI-generated images that are obviously fake, but still used to create a positive in-group image, AI photo generators have also been found to generate stereotypical images of groups such as refugees and migrants, LGBTIQ people, or plus people, etc. Do you have any data on the proliferation of these types of images and how they are reshared, perhaps across platforms, and best practices on how platforms may deal with them, watermarks, community notes, etc.?
I mean, we don't have data on the sharing and circulation of these images. I think that's an interesting study, an important study to conduct next. I think it's a good research idea for anyone interested to do that. I'm honestly not really convinced with the watermark or these sort of flagging stuff. I don't think it's going to be very efficient. And also because in some cases, and this is not for the image, the fake imagery, but it's more for the deepfake videos, for example, the deepfake voices. I think in the worst instances, we have a mix of real things and fake segments. So you'd have a real video of someone saying things, and within this video, you just alter, let's say, 1 or 2 sentences, and you replace these sentences by synthetic fake sentences. So in these kind of blended authentic/fake deepfakes, you're very unlikely to really actually spot, or detect and have the kind of warning that this is fake. But what may work, and we've seen this a bit on Twitter/X, is this kind of community node, where you can sort of flag and say, well, beware, people think this is a fake image. Yeah, in the Ukrainian conflict, for example, quite a few images that were shared were sort of flagged, like, oh, look, this is actually not a real image of an explosion in an oil refinery. It's a fake image. I'm not sure if it has slowed down the circulation of these images, but it cannot do. I mean, I think we need to use all the tools that we have and that we can design to slow down the phenomenon, because there's not one magic bullet. I think we need to develop and deploy as many tools as we can to slow down.
Yeah, and I think talking about the question there with the stereotypical images, and going back to my earlier point about the need for government, big tech and academic collaboration, I think it's important to note how these systems are trained. Like, they're trained by images pulled from the internet. So if these systems are generating sort of stereotypical images of migrants, refugees, and other specific groups, it's because these images appear online with these sort of captions next to them. That's how these systems are learning. So, maybe thinking of what these systems are using as their training data, but approaching it in that kind of way might also help. Like Stephane said, there's no one silver bullet. It's going to be a whole hodgepodge of different things that we're going to have to try and do.
And along those lines, we don't have another question in the box, but so I'll pop one in. As we get more of this sort of extremist content generated and sitting out there, given the sort of way models are being trained potentially, like, what impact do you think that'll have on the models themselves and broader, like, mainstream use?
So, so there is some quite amusing data now showing that some of these models are actually starting to generate some poor images, because there's now so much AI generated images out there that these AI generated images are now feeding into the input training data on the models, and so certain imperfections are being fed in. So things like, famously, AI generated images can't produce hands, right? And the reason for that is that if you think of a human face, there's only so many ways the face can use. So it can look in an image. If you look at the hand, it can do any one of a number of things. So these AI generated have never been able to produce hands. And we're seeing some of the sort of models that are perhaps trained on a smaller subset of training data, starting to regurgitate some of these imperfections. But from what I've seen, it has been these models that are trained on less data. The big ones that are trained on larger samples of data, they're getting better, right, because they're looking at much more data.
I was just going to say, if you have any sort of last comments, we're going to get ready to wrap up here. If anyone has a last question, throw it into the box. But Lewys or Stephane, any sort of closing comments?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one point that we touched upon here, but maybe stressing again, is the fact that you don't just have the, we think usually in terms of extremist actors, online typically, or extremist organizations, and then the public that they want to inflame or to radicalize. But in the report, we made clear that very often we have third parties who are interested in boosting extremist content online, but third parties who are not necessarily, authentically extremists. And we shouldn't forget that in many parts of the extremist online ecosystems, you do have influences of external states. And so here I think it's also important to recognize that some of these uses are likely or are already harnessed by states in order to fuel extremism in different contexts. So, for example, Russia and Russian operatives creating extremist content that looks authentic or that looks not authentic, but that looks local in different regions of the world. So they're tuned to the existing polarizing and polarization lines, and they produce content that looks, for example, French, or that looks, from Burkina Faso, that looks American. But actually, it's not produced by genuine American, French, or Burkinabe extremists. It's produced by Russians. But so it's also important to know that when you study these online ecosystems, especially now that AI uses this ability to produce more and to multiply your effects and your reach, we'll find that these states like Russia or China, they're inevitably going to play that card, and so we should be aware that what we think is original or local or part of a national ecosystem, in fact, the line between extremism in a local context and international relations and the shifting geopolitical environments nowadays and the rising tensions between the West and states like Russia or China, this is worsening the problem, right? The line is thin and is getting thinner with all these processes. So we should be aware also that there's a much bigger political sort of environment situation that worsens the problem of real extremists using AI to promote their agenda. They are helped from the outside, sometimes without them knowing. And so that's I think an important thing that we also flag in the report.
Excellent. Thank you. Lewis, do you have any closing comments?
No, just to re-emphasize my view that, yeah, this stuff's going to become easier to use, and that it's going to be easier to use exponentially. We've already seen it do that. The problems we've laid out here are only going to get worse, and yeah, I think going forward we do need tighter industry, government, and academic relationships in order to sort of best come up with a way to tackle this problem. Because like Stephane said a moment ago, we're not going to come up with one silver bullet. It's going to be a whole bunch of different little things we enact piecemeal.
Well, thank you so much for your discussion and for the report. Thank you to our audience who asked excellent questions. I just wanted to remind everyone, if you would like to look at this or other VOX-Pol publications, including blogs and a variety of other resources, I'm throwing the VOX-Pol publication page into the chat. I will also put the direct link for this PDF into the chat. And just remind everyone that if you want regular updates from VOX-Pol, please feel free to sign up for our newsletter on the website. There's a bunch of great information comes out, I think, once a month. So it's been a pleasure having you both and talking about your work. And I hope to talk about it more in the future. It's really interesting and I think super useful. So thank you to everyone. And that's the end of our program today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.